The wire transfer hit my account on a Tuesday, $1.3 million. I stared at the screen for an hour, watching the digits sit there, static and heavy. My pulse hammered against my ribs, but the house remained quiet. 3 weeks later, the silence felt different. I sat at the head of the long oak table, surrounded by the same faces I had known my entire life. The dinner was slow. My uncle cleared his throat, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and leaned across the wood. "So, how much did you really get?" The room stopped. My mother lowered her fork, the metal clinking softly against the plate. My brother stared at his wine glass, his jaw tight. I looked around the circle. They were not looking at me. They were measuring me. The air grew thin. Every eye in the room was calculating, weighing my bank account against their own struggles. I pushed my chair back an inch, the legs scraping against the floor, and felt the weight of the $1 million pressing down on my shoulders. I had expected a celebration. Instead, I had become an outsider in my own home. I looked away from their faces, back toward a time before the numbers existed. The scent of grease and burning oil filled my memory. I saw my father in the driveway, his hands stained dark, struggling to fix a rusted sedan just to keep the lights on for another month. I remember the sound of my mother counting out grocery coupons on the kitchen counter, her lips moving silently as she tracked every penny. I spent my youth in the spaces between those moments. While my peers slept, I was in the garage, hunched over stacks of paperwork, building a business from nothing. I learned to trade sleep for progress. I learned that every dollar was a brick in a wall I was building to keep that poverty out. I thought success would be my escape, a way to leave the rust and the coupons behind forever. But sitting there, listening to the silence of my family, I realized that I had only been trading one kind of hunger for another. I had built the life they saw, but I had done it in the dark, away from their eyes, and now the distance between us felt like a chasm that no amount of money could bridge. The heavy silence at the table finally fractured. My brother leaned forward, his hands flat against the wooden surface. Moving into my space, he did not look at me with the familiarity of our shared youth. Instead, his gaze was fixed, calculating, and weighted with unspoken expectations. He spoke in a low, steady tone, outlining a business venture of his own, a failing shop that needed a massive injection of capital to survive. He needed me to be the savior. He needed the wire transfer to mean something more than just a number on a screen. I felt the air in the room thicken. Every scrap of progress I had made felt like a debt I was suddenly expected to pay back. I looked at the fork in his hand, the way his knuckles were white from the tension of the request. He was not asking for help. He was asking for me to validate the years he felt he had lost in my shadow. My chest tightened. I could feel the wall I had built around my success rising higher, blocking out the light, making it impossible to see the man sitting across from me as anything other than a demand. The distance between us was no longer just about money. It was about the life he thought I owed him. I looked him in the eye and said no. I did not soften the word. I did not offer a compromise or a promise to reconsider. The air left the room. My brother reacted before I could even draw a full breath. He slammed his fork down against the fine china, a sharp, metallic crack that echoed against the silence of the other guests. He stood up, his chair scraping harshly across the floorboards. He leaned in, his face inches from mine, and his voice dropped to a jagged whisper. "You are not one of us anymore." That sentence landed with the weight of a physical blow. It was sharper than any bankruptcy filing, colder than any market crash. I felt the breath catch in my throat. He turned his back on me and walked out, leaving the rest of the table in a stunned, suffocating quiet. I sat there, gripped by the sudden realization that I had successfully protected my assets, but I had completely obliterated the only connection that mattered. The wealth I had spent my life chasing was sitting in my account, but it could not buy back the look of contempt he had just leveled at me. I was a millionaire, and I had never felt more bankrupt. I fled the house that night, driving until the city lights became blurred streaks against the glass. I went straight to my office, locking the door behind me. I did not want to see anyone. I did not want to speak. I sat at my desk and pulled up the spreadsheets, the glowing blue light of the monitors casting long, harsh shadows across the room. I worked for hours, drowning out the echo of that whispered rejection with the click of keys and the hum of servers. Every deal I closed felt hollow. I watched the numbers climb, watching millions flow into accounts I no longer cared about. There was no one to call, no one to share the win with. My phone sat face down on the mahogany surface, silent. I paced the length of the room, my footsteps clicking loudly against the polished floor, a sound that only made the emptiness feel more expansive. I had built a fortress, but I was the only one trapped inside. I poured a drink, held the heavy glass, and stared at the empty chairs surrounding my desk. The success I had craved was a cold, silent room. I had everything I had ever wanted, and yet, I was entirely alone in the dark. The silence of my office was broken by the sharp, rhythmic vibration of my phone against the desk. It was an unfamiliar number. I picked it up, and the voice on the other end was clipped, professional, and terrifyingly calm. My father had collapsed, heart failure. The drive to the hospital was a blur of red lights and missed turns. I left my car crookedly in the emergency lane, running until my lungs burned, my mind racing with thoughts of specialists and the best private care money could buy. I pushed through the double doors, the smell of antiseptic hitting me like a physical barrier. I reached the room and stopped. The space was small, dimly lit, and filled with the mechanical clicking of life support. My father lay on the bed, his chest rising and falling with a shallow, labored cadence. I looked at the monitors, watching the green lines trace the rhythm of his failing pulse. I reached for his hand, but it felt thin and fragile against my palm. All the capital, all the assets, and all the influence I had accumulated in the last few years meant nothing here. I was a man of immense net worth, standing in a room where money could not buy a single additional heartbeat. I sat in the plastic chair for hours, watching the shadows lengthen against the white walls. My father shifted, his eyes opening slowly. He looked at me, not with the weight of expectation I had feared, but with a clarity that made the room feel suddenly still. He struggled to find his breath, then began to speak, his voice a dry rasp. He did not talk about the hospital or his health. He talked about the past. He told me about the land, the small plot he had tended for 20 years, the place where he intended to spend his final years in peace. He had sold it years ago, in secret, while I was still struggling to launch my business. Every cent of that sale had been funneled into my startup through an anonymous account. He had traded his future for mine. He had watched me succeed from the sidelines, never asking for a return, never even mentioning the debt. I looked at his hands, calloused and mapped with veins, and realized they had held the foundation of my empire. I had been so busy counting my growth that I had never seen the ground I was standing on. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with the truth of what it actually cost to build a life. I looked down at my phone, the screen showing a balance that had once defined my identity. It now felt like a list of numbers on a ledger, devoid of meaning. I was a millionaire sitting in a sterile room, feeling like the poorest man on earth. The greed I had attributed to my family, the resentment I had built toward their requests, it all dissolved into a sharp, painful clarity. They were not asking for a piece of my success. They were reaching out to be part of the life they had physically enabled. I had spent years guarding my assets, building walls around my gains, and treating my kin like creditors. I realized then that I had been counting digits while ignoring the debt of love that made my existence possible. The air in the room seemed to thin. I gripped the edge of the bed frame, the metal cold and unyielding against my palms. My perspective shifted. The walls of my isolation crumbled under the weight of this truth. My family was not a threat to my prosperity. They were the architects of it. I had been hoarding wealth, believing it was my shield, but it was merely a barrier. The realization was a physical ache in my chest, a total reordering of my world. I walked out of the hospital and straight to the dealership. I handed over the keys to the luxury car I had bought as a trophy of my status. It felt lighter to let it go. I returned to my old, modest house, the one with the creaking floorboards and the drafty windows. It was no longer a symbol of where I had been, but a foundation for who I was becoming. I stopped checking my account balance every morning. I stopped wearing the watch that cost more than my first business loan. The change was subtle at first. I went to the local market and nobody looked at me with that calculating, guarded expression I had grown so used to. They looked at my face. They asked about my day. When the money was hidden, the wall between me and the world finally fell. I still worked hard, but the hunger to prove myself through acquisitions had vanished. I stood on my porch, watching the neighborhood move through its routines, and for the first time in years, I felt like a neighbor instead of an outsider. The tension was still there, but it was manageable. I was no longer defined by the digits on a screen. I was simply present. I sit in the armchair beside him now, watching the steady, shallow rise and fall of his chest. He is resting, finally free from the decades of quiet labor that bought my freedom. I traced the lines on his hands, the same hands that repaired rusted engines and signed away his own future to fund my first venture. I understand now that the true inheritance was never the money. It was the sacrifice. The millions in my account are just paper. The real currency is the love that paved the path I walk today. If you are the first one to break the cycle of poverty, hear this: the loneliness you feel is a heavy price, but you were never truly alone. The people who built your foundation are still standing right behind you, even when you cannot see them. Stop counting the digits on your screen. Start looking at the hearts around you. Success is not a destination you reach in isolation. It is a shared journey. When the noise of the world fades, the only thing left that holds weight is the debt of love you owe to those who gave everything so you could have a chance. Do not lose sight of them in your climb. They are the reason you are standing here.